Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Kiri Kankwende, and I'm Head of Press and Public Affairs at CSW. In this one-hour webinar, we're exploring the question, examining religious persecution. Does it occur in the UK? While this session is aimed at leaders in the church, I'm sure it will be hugely helpful to you all. It is the second in a series of 3 events hosted by the Right Reverend Philip Mount Stephen, Bishop of Truro, and Mervyn Thomas CMG, the founder-president of CSW. For this event, we're also delighted to welcome as a guest panelist, the Right Reverend Gully Francis Dehani, Bishop of Chelmsford. We'll have time for a Q&A towards the end, so please do drop your questions into the chat box and we will get to them before the end. For those who are not present for episode 1 of the series that we've been hosting, I'm going to introduce our first speaker once again. The Right Reverend Philip Mount Stephen, prior to becoming 16th Bishop of Truro, was the executive leader of the Church Mission Society, enabling networking across the Anglican Communion and beyond. In December 2018, Bishop Philip was asked by the then Foreign Secretary to investigate how well or otherwise the Foreign Office had responded to the global issue of the persecution of Christians. The recommendations of the subsequent report were accepted in full by the UK government. Bishop Philip retains a significant interest in this area and also chairs the Church of England's Partnership for World Mission, the umbrella body which gathers together the Church of England's various specialist mission agencies. He's now going to kick us off by recapping episode 1 and looking at how the word persecution is used in Scripture. Bishop Philip, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kiri, and welcome everybody to the second of these seminars. So as Kiri says, I'm just going to give a sort of a lightning tour of what I said in the first session, exploring the theology of religion, of freedom of religion or belief, before looking at this issue of persecution in Scripture in more detail. As Kiri said, I was asked to by the Foreign Secretary to look specifically at the way that the Foreign Office had responded to the issue of the persecution of Christians. But my recommendations were framed very much in terms of guaranteeing freedom of religion or belief for everybody. I did that as a matter of policy because I wanted the recommendations to gain traction in a liberal Western democracy. But also because, frankly, I believe in freedom of religion or belief for everybody, and I do not believe that there is any Christian compromise involved in advocating for freedom of religion or belief for everybody. And my basic reasons for arguing for that are first of all that actually campaigning for freedom of religion or belief does not hinder or inhibit the sharing of the gospel or evangelism. It means that we are guaranteeing people's freedom to choose the path that they take in terms of faith, and indeed to change faith if that's what they want to do. And I do believe that God-given right to choose what and who we believe in is a God-given right. The right to choose is hardwired into the biblical narrative. We see it very clearly in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 2. So we need to treat people, I believe, as responsible, as people who can make responsible choices in terms of how they order their lives, and certainly in terms of which faith they follow and how they follow it. As I say, recognizing that might mean that they make a choice, as I certainly hope and pray that they do, that they will make a choice to follow Jesus Christ. And it is just finally in this brief introduction on Jesus that I want to focus. And it seems to me that there are 2 fundamental reasons why, as Christians, we should advocate for freedom of religion or belief for everybody. First of all, because in his teaching, Jesus defined the concept of neighbor in the broadest possible terms, and that is surely the point of the parable of the Good Samaritan, that our neighbor is not simply someone who is near us and like us, but someone who may well be different from us and distant from us and different to us. So I think in Jesus' teaching about neighbor, if we take that seriously, we will also take seriously the freedom of religion or belief of those who were very different from us. And also, I think we need to have a proper theology of the cross in all of this, actually. In one of our Anglican prayers, we talk Jesus opening wide his arms upon the cross. And the cross is an inclusive act that embraces the whole world. God so loved the whole world that he gave his only son, that all who believe in him should not perish but have eternal life. Death of Jesus is not a limited thing, but a comprehensive thing. And if God's love is universally embracing of everybody, then I believe that ours should be as well. So there we are. That's just a very brief recap of what I said last time. Let's dive into this question about the persecution in Scripture and what we find there. And I am in a way going to set Merv a little bit of a problem in saying what I'm about to say, but I have no doubt that he is more than up to addressing the problem that I create for him. So this is my basic thesis. There is a very good argument that says that historically persecution has been the normal state of things for the church, not an exception at all, and that the church should always therefore expect it to some degree. Discrimination, marginalization, pressure, persecution. There is, of course, a sliding scale. And if the church should always expect it, then we do need to know how to understand it. Indeed, much of the New Testament was written in a context where Christian faith faced significant hostility, if not persecution. I've always been really struck by John's words at the beginning of Revelation, where he describes himself like this. He says, I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus. Now, it's noticeable that he's not just describing his own situation, but that of those he's writing to as well. And I do think there's a really good argument that that is our normal state as Christians, that across the world, we are brothers and sisters and companions in the suffering and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are ours in Jesus. And all three of those are important. Yes, the kingdom, but also the suffering that goes with the kingdom and the patient endurance that is ours as we await the kingdom in all its fullness. This idea that persecution is part of the normal state of things for the Church of God, I think is hardwired into Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. These words are probably very familiar to us. Ask any Christian reasonably familiar with their Bible to quote one of the Beatitudes, and they would, I suggest, quite easily come up with something like, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, or blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Or they might think of the famous hymn, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see our God. But how likely would it be, I wonder, that a Western Christian would come up with, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven? Not, I suspect, all that likely. We are very happy to take the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes as normative for Christians, and yet we are nonetheless inclined, I suggest, to ignore the last two of them, for they're indeed not one but two Beatitudes dedicated to persecution. And that's the theme they end on, with Jesus saying, blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Two Beatitudes dedicated to persecution. And those last words that I just quoted emphasize how normative persecution is for people of Christian faith, for people of Judeo-Christian faith, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And we, of course, follow one who was killed on a cross for blasphemy. Jesus was himself the victim of religious persecution. And one of the two crosses that customarily I wear around my neck is a vivid symbol of the persecution not only that Jesus faced, but that faced by many of our brothers and sisters today. I'm not wearing them today, but one of them is a very Cornish cross made partly of tin and based on the Christ figure from an ancient Celtic cross. But the other we found in the offices of Church Mission Society where I used to work. It comes from Nasik Diocese in the Indian state of Maharashtra, and I wear it in solidarity with my brothers and sisters in India who face ever-increasing pressure and persecution in that country, and I wear it too as a sign of solidarity with the whole persecuted church. So both the Beatitudes and the cross remind us that there's something normative about persecution for the Christian church. And if we don't currently face it, then we should be thankful for that. But if it is normative, we should ask ourselves how we would face it were it ever to come. And that brings us to what I think are some really significant words from the book of Daniel. Daniel is a book all about persecution. You know that. We think of the lion's den and the fiery furnace. And the apocalyptic second half of the book is a direct inspiration for much of the book of Revelation, written by John, persecuted for his faith in exile on Patmos. And indeed, the persecution of the early church is the essential background for understanding the book of Revelation. But to come back to Daniel, and I want to focus particularly on some words of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's not so much their rescue from the fiery furnace I want to focus on, but what they say to Nebuchadnezzar. And these are words which I think are so important in articulating what you might call a spirituality of persecution. This is what they say. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. Now, of course, they were delivered from the fiery furnace, but there was no guarantee that they would be. But the point is that delivered or not, their resolve was unfaltering. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. If you want a modern parallel to that, think of the 21 Coptic Christians martyred on a beach in Libya. They could have said, indeed, in effect, they did say just what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, and they were not rescued. Instead, they died with the name of the Lord Jesus on their lips because they would not renounce their faith nor their belief and trust in him. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. And the simple question this leaves me with, and I leave this with you too, is this: how would you react in such a situation, remember, which is normative for many Christians across the world today? Would I too say whatever was the equivalent of, but if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up? Or would I falter and surrender? I honestly don't know any more, I guess, than any of us would until brought to that point. But let's remember that countless Christians throughout history and across the world today face just such a choice. They are our brothers and sisters and companions in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus. So let's above all pray for them, do all we can to support them, hold them in our hearts and minds, as no doubt they would for us were the tables turned. But of course, this does set up that problematic question that I mentioned at the beginning. If persecution is the normal state of the Church of God, do we face persecution in the UK? Or are we the exception that proves the rule? Or do we conclude, looking at the seriousness of what brothers and sisters the world over face, that actually we don't face persecution? Those are vital questions, but fortunately not ones that I have to answer. So I'm going to leave that to Merv. Thank you, Merv.
Thank you, Bishop Philip. I'm really haunted by the question that you've posed to us, and I'm sure Mervyn is also thinking fast with the question that you've asked him. I just want to remind you all, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We will get round to them in the Q&A section, which I'm sure you'll be keen to take part in towards the end of the session. Our second speaker is Mervyn Thomas, founder-president of CSW, a Christian human rights organization standing with those facing injustice for their beliefs and advocating for freedom of religion or belief. Mervyn is the chair of the UK Forum Steering Group and works closely with the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion or Belief. He has testified in the British Parliament, at the EU, and within US Congress. He has also spoken in churches of all denominations, inspiring Christians to take their stand against injustice. I'd like to hand over to him now to go a little deeper into the legal and lay understanding of persecution, and of course to answer Bishop Philip's question. Over to you, Merv.
Well, thank you very much, I was hoping, Kiri, you wouldn't say that last bit about answering Philip's question. I hope with all the introduction, everybody would have forgotten what Philip had asked. I do intend to talk about something different to what Philip talked about, but it's a real actually, Philip, I think you've set us up for a fourth seminar in many respects, because this is a really good question to ask, and I'm not going to answer it simply, and I think maybe we can come back to it in the Q&A at the end, because it's really important. And I have to say, I agree with every word you've said, and it's something that we often think about in CSW. I've often thought about over the 40 odd years I've been doing this, and I do always remember coming sort of back to one of your final questions there. I've often asked myself the question, how would I react when, Leah Sharibu, 14-year-old Nigerian schoolgirl, was able to go free if she just converted to Islam. Everybody else was set free. All of her friends set free. She refused to and said, "I'm a follower of Jesus." I don't know if I would have said that. And I hand on heart, and I've been a Christian virtually all my life. But we don't know the answer to those questions. I always remember many years ago, there used to be a poster. You saw them in Christian bookshops, and it was of a judge looking over the courtroom and saying, and the caption on the thing was, if you were tried and accused of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? And I think that's a really good question that we can ask ourselves. But I'll leave it there, and I'll go into the talk that I prepared, and maybe we'll come back to it later. But thank you for posing it, Philip. It's really, really important. So even though CSW doesn't work on domestic religious freedom, I have to say that whenever I speak in a church or anywhere, one of the first questions I nearly always get asked is, what about the persecution in the UK? And if I'm honest with you, my answer is always very simple, and that is that there is no persecution in the UK. But we do often see discrimination, and sometimes we see marginalisation too. But persecution, no. You see, persecution is a much overused word. So let me give you the definition contained in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. This is what it says. It says that persecution is the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights contrary to international law by reason of the identity of the group or collectivity on political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, gender, or other grounds that are universally recognized as impermissible under international law. And persecution is listed listed in Article 7 amongst other acts such as murder, extermination, torture, enslavement, and it's listed as a crime against humanity when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. Obviously, that's quite different to how the word persecution is so often used in common parlance. But my point today is that we must be very careful to ensure that we don't use the term lightly. To satisfy the legal definition of the crime of persecution, the deprivation of fundamental rights must be severe, which means that not every violation of freedom of religion or belief will constitute persecution. To give an example, if an individual's home or property is destroyed on account of their religion or belief, that's an awful thing, and it must be condemned. But depending on the surrounding circumstances, it may not necessarily constitute persecution, despite the presence of discriminatory intent. However, if attacks on property are widespread, persistent, and form part of an intentional campaign to destroy the economic livelihood of a religious community, the severity requirement would be satisfied. It's important to make this distinction because if we fail to use the term correctly when describing fraud violations, we can imbue less serious violations with a notion of severity that's neither present nor appropriate. This in turn can easily be dismissed, often to the detriment of individuals and communities that are experiencing religious discrimination or harassment, which may be precursors to genuine persecution. And let me say, you know, it's rare that persecution suddenly comes from nowhere. It's rare. We often see a sliding scale, if you like, which often will start with disinformation in the media, disinformation put out perhaps by governments or by political groups. But that disinformation can lead on to discrimination or marginalization, and that in turn can and often does lead to outright persecution. But I don't believe in the UK we have got that at all, but we are certainly on the lower end of that sliding scale, and therefore we need to be aware that it could come one day, and maybe ask ourselves those questions, and certainly ask ourselves those questions that Philip just posed us. So I mean, CSW has worked on several high-profile cases of legally recognised religious persecution over the years. In 2016, a UN Commission of Inquiry on Eritrea found reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity have been committed by state officials in a widespread and systematic manner since 1991, including the crime of persecution against religious and ethnic groups. Similarly, in 2017, I visited northern Iraq, where I had the opportunity to meet with both Christians and Yazidis. We were actually there in Mosul just a week after it had been liberated from 3 years of tyranny under ISIS. And those Christians and Yazidis that I met, their lives have been devastated by the violence of the Islamic State. I was told of horrific persecution. I met people who had suffered incredible persecution involving, in many cases, widespread killings, kidnappings. I heard from one particularly harrowing story from a girl who had been trafficked. And, you know, 6,000 women and girls were both Christian and Yazidi were trafficked by ISIS. And in fact, still around half of those 6,000 are still missing today. And the UN has since officially recognized the mistreatment suffered particularly by the Yazidis as genocide. There's also the case of the predominantly Muslim Rohingya people in Myanmar or Burma. They had faced widespread societal hostility and discrimination for decades. But in 2017, a campaign of violence against them resulted in over 700,000 people fleeing to Bangladesh, thousands of deaths and hundreds of villages burnt. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has since described the violence against the Rohingya as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing, while the US government formally determined it to be genocide in March this year. What is particularly concerning is that the same military that committed these atrocity crimes is now actually in power in the country following the coup in February last year. In all of these cases, we're talking about violations that meet the thresholds laid out in the Rome Statute. To reiterate that these are acts committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. They require the implementation of justice through the international legal system. And it's vital that we do not dilute or confuse these calls with some of the frustrating issues that we as Christians can face here in the UK, but for which we can access legal redress. We should also bear in mind that even the biblical references to persecution, if you read Hebrews chapter 11, particularly towards the end of that chapter, it refers to really severe violations, which include torture and flogging and what we would term today as being arbitrary detention. It talks about death by stoning, by beheading, and by the sword, at the hands of those actively seeking to prevent the growth of Christianity. So, as I come to a close, how do we respond? You know, and I said this many times, I believe that today we live in a world where there is more awareness at a political level of these issues than there has ever been in the whole of my lifetime. And that's why there's going to be a ministerial conference in London on the 5th and 6th of July, because politically, gathering together perhaps some 70 foreign ministers around the world who recognise that freedom of religion or belief is being violated around the world. But even though there is this incredible political awareness, sad to say, I feel the church really needs to step up in this regard. I find, I find as I go around churches that there are large, and I believe there are large portions of the church, and when I say the church, I'm talking about the church of all denominations. I know we've got 2 Anglican bishops here, but I'm not just talking about the wonderful Anglican church. I'm talking about the church generally. Can be very inward looking, introverted, and focused on their various very good programs. Don't get me wrong, I think it's vital to have teaching on evangelism, on 21st century Christian living, on discipleship, on prayer, all of these really important things, but there also needs to be teaching on the subject of religious freedom and the violations of religious freedom or belief around the world, and especially our response to them as Christians. It bears emphasizing once again that this shouldn't just be about Christian persecution and only speaking up for Christians. I often hear people quote that verse from Galatians 6 verse 10 that says that we are to do good to all, but especially to the household of faith or the household of believers, which version you read. Unfortunately, many of us ignore the first part of the verse, which says do good to all, but overemphasize the second part that says especially to the household of faith. As Philip talked about the parable of what we call the parable of the Good Samaritan, in response to that question that Jesus was asked, who is my neighbor? He tells us in Luke 10 that our neighbor actually is everybody, and especially those who are very different to us, especially those who we don't get along with. That's why we say in CSW that as Christians, we stand with everyone facing injustice because of their religion or belief. We do that as Christians. That's our Christian duty. We do that because it's the right thing to do. It's what Jesus did and what Jesus would have us do. After all, if a Christian and a Muslim knocked on your door now and wanted some food because they were hungry, I don't believe you would ask them what their religion was. And I don't believe if you found out that one was a Christian and a Muslim that you would only feed the Christian. I sincerely hope that we wouldn't. We would feed them both. Every Christian must make it their duty to stand up and speak out against injustice everywhere, because if we don't, who will? Thank you.
Thank you, Mervyn. And thank you for underpinning that word persecution and explaining how it points towards justice, particularly in the legal terms. You've also thrown up some interesting questions, which we'll return to in the Q&A, along with the questions that Bishop Philip has also posed. And I encourage the rest of you, if you have any questions, pop them into the Q&A box. I'm really looking forward to a discussion later on. Add them in and we'll get to them in the discussion. It's my pleasure now to introduce the Right Reverend Guli Francis Dehani, who was born in Isfahan, Iran, where she lived for the first 14 years of her life. Following the effects of the Islamic Revolution, she moved to England with her family and has to date been unable to return to Iran. After leaving the BBC in 1994, Bishop Guli completed an MA in Religious Studies and soon afterwards began working on her PhD, which she was awarded in May 1999. She was ordained in the Church of England in 1998. She has contributed to various publications, especially in the area of interfaith studies and religious feminism. She's also a contributor on Radio 4's Thought for the Day. Bishop Guli is Vice President of the Conference of European Churches, Vice Chair of the Church Army, and the Church of England's lead bishop for housing. She was appointed as the Bishop of Loughborough in 2017 and has been the Bishop of Chelmsford since March 2021. I will now invite her to share her personal perspective and the situation for religious minorities in Iran, as well as her reflections on the UK Church's response. Over to you, Bishop Guli.
Thank you very much indeed, Kiri, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to have to be very, very disciplined because both Bishop Philip and Merv have said some really interesting things that I'm tempted to offer some reflections in response to, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stick with what you asked me to do, which is to say a little bit about my own story in terms of my experiences in the church in Iran, and to say again a few words about the situation of churches in Iran now, and then very, very brief reflections on whether it's persecution that we experience in this country or not. And I will try to keep as brief as possible because I suspect the most interesting bit will be in the questions that we want plenty of time for. So yeah, as Kyria said, I was born and grew up in Iran. I had an unusual upbringing, I guess. I'm the daughter of, my father was a convert from Islam, and my mother was the daughter of missionaries who'd been in Iran. So she herself was born in Iran. So I grew up during the 70s at a time when the church, the Anglican Church in Iran, which had its roots in the missionary movement, was really seeking to develop an identity as an indigenous Persian Christian community, with all the challenges and opportunities that went with that. And questions around identity and belonging and all of those kinds of themes were very significant, both for me as an individual as I grew up, but also for our small church community. It was always a small community from the outset. We had 4 or 5 church buildings scattered across the country, with relatively small numbers in the high hundreds, probably. I think Iran, even in those days and certainly now, is probably the smallest Anglican diocese in the communion, the smallest numerically, and one of the largest, second or third largest geographically. So it just gives you a sense of how small and vulnerable we always were. But pre-revolution, we did have a degree of security through the stability of the central government. And there was often a sense that there were factions, there were fundamentalist factions waiting in the wings for their opportunity. And this speaks to what Merv was saying, that persecution doesn't come from nowhere. There are usually seeds that you can identify that may or may not grow into full-scale persecution. And so we would be aware from time to time of being followed, or people in the church community, there as government spies, that kind of thing. And we were always struggling with this sense of being identified with the West, because our roots were in the missionary movement, and a sense that we were regarded as interlopers, Western interlopers, and betrayers of our national identity. But as I say, things were relatively comfortable, and the different worlds that I inhabited as a child between church and school. For example, I was at an entirely Muslim school, speaking English and Persian. I grew up bilingually, and then with the influence of kind of Eastern Persian culture, obviously, and the Western culture that the missionaries brought with them. Those two worlds that I inhabited coexisted relatively peaceably alongside one another, with occasional bits of overlap. So it was unusual upbringing, but happy, and for the most part peaceful. All of that began to change with the advent of the Islamic Revolution, which its roots again go way back to the 50s and 60s, if not earlier than that. But it began to surface, it bubbled to the surface, I guess, in the summer of 1978 and into 1979, when I was around about 12, 13. And the whole country, of course, was impacted by the massive changes that were going on. And in the early stages of the revolution in particular, as is common with a revolution, there was a lot of chaos and eventually anarchy before the Islamic Republic as it now is emerged. And during that period, there was lots of disruptions in the country generally. So as one example, schools were closed for months on end, and as children, you know, we were left to our own devices at home. And in my context, the church community and the missionaries tried to set up kind of classes for us, just to give us something to do and to keep our education bubbling over. But in all kinds of ways, the country was in chaos. And during that period, a kind of wave of persecution began to be experienced by the church. So from things like raids on offices and our house. My father was the bishop in Iran, the bishop's house. The murder of one of our clergy who was found murdered in his study. The confiscation of properties like hospitals and schools that we ran as a church. The legal identity of the church was stripped, and the financial assets were frozen. So there was a gradual stripping away of some of the structures that had been built up over the years. My father, as a convert bishop, was imprisoned briefly, just for a week or so before he was released. And then eventually, what culminated for us as a family, while my father was out of the country for meetings, actually, was that my brother was murdered. My brother was 24 at the time, and in effect, he became a scapegoat, we think, for my father. No one was ever brought to justice. There had been an attempt on my father's life before that, in which my mother had been injured. She was shot, but she survived. They both survived that. And after my brother was murdered in May 1980, my father, at that point, it was clear that he couldn't come back to the country, that this tiny church community wanted to have their leader alive outside than come walking back into what would have been certain death by that stage. It's a long, complicated story, which I'm trying to minimize because of time. So my mother and my elder sister and I buried my brother. And 2 weeks later, in fact, tomorrow will be the 42nd anniversary of my brother's death. He died on 6th of May. We left with a suitcase each, thinking that we'd be home within maybe a few months, a year at the most. And that was never to be. And so here I am, as it were, 42 years later, settled in this country, arriving initially as a refugee. And my parents have now died several years ago. So that's just a whistle-stop tour, if I can call it that, of my experiences during the revolution in Iran. The church has continued to suffer waves of persecution, if I can call it that, but a very heavy, oppressive hand. So most of our, 3 of our church buildings are still standing. Interestingly, they were never closed. So the church community didn't go underground. They were closed as a result of COVID and have never reopened. And I wonder whether this is the government's chance now for them to never reopen. We'll have to wait and see. But what I would describe is a strategy of slow, long-term suffocation to see the community out, because baptisms are illegal, so it's not possible to engage new members. And so many people have left the country, either fleeing or for other reasons. The numbers are minuscule, and it's difficult to see how, in the current circumstances, it can grow. But for me, the miracle is, frankly, that it's still there, and that speaks in a way to the language of faith, and Philip's point that the persecution is actually the norm for the Christian experience. So that's just a little bit about the ongoing life of the churches. And then finally, just a comment about, and perhaps this will take us into more questions around this area. Is it persecution that we can call it in terms of what we experience in this country? Hand on heart, I don't think we can call it that. I'm with Merv on that. I mean, there's a line, isn't there? And it's difficult to know precisely where that line is. But I don't think we've crossed it in this country. Absolutely discrimination, some, pushback, social media can, all of that stuff. Actually, I think our biggest problem in this country is that we're regarded as irrelevant. It's more that people, frankly, aren't even interested. That's much more of a problem for me than persecution. So, alongside that, perhaps I would end by saying, I think one of the challenges for us is we also have a culture now in which everybody seems to feel that they have the right never to be offended. And so it's very easy for people, if they feel offended by something, to say my human right has been not upheld, I'm being persecuted. So that in itself is an interesting debate for me. To what extent can we assume that it's a right never to be offended, and where does that tip over into inappropriate discrimination and then eventually to persecution? So I think that's plenty from me, and I'm going to hand back to Kiri.
Thank you so much, Bishop Willie, and for sharing the memories of your brother as well, and your family. It's an honour to hear that. And for your reflections. I think that does actually lead us quite naturally into the next part of our event, which is a Q&A. You can still add questions to the box, but I'm going to, I guess, start with just an initial question that has come in. And I think each of you in your contributions have sort of hinted towards this. I will ask the question, perhaps to one person, but you can join in afterwards with each panelist can also respond if you'd like. So I guess I'd put it, the first one, to Mervyn. How do we respond to what is happening in the UK?
Well, as individual Christians, we have a responsibility, first of all, to speak out, to speak up, to, Proverbs 31 verses 8 and 9, and I'm paraphrasing, it tells us to speak up for those unable to speak for themselves. I think, and we need to recognise that all of the time we remain silent, actually we're complicit in the persecution that is going on in the world. And so, our response must be to stand up and to speak out. But how do we do that? Well, it's the way to do it in this country is, first and foremost, is to be writing to our Member of Parliament, to be to tell others in our church. I often say to people when I go to churches and I speak, and I always talk about our 4 Ps actually at CSW that we often talk about, to pray. Prayer is the number one thing that we can all do, whoever we are, and prayer does make a difference. So we can pray, but secondly we can protest, and we can protest by making making representations to parliamentarians and to others. We can provide, and we can provide in a number of ways. You can provide for organisations like CSW and others like it by supporting the work that we do. But we can also provide, by writing letters of encouragement to Christians and others who are in prison for their faith, or to the families of those that have suffered for what they believe. But the last thing we can do is what we call proclaim. We can tell other people. And, when I'm at churches, so often people come to me afterwards and they say, but we had no idea this was going on. This is terrible. What can I do? And the first thing I always say to them is that the first thing you can do is not forget about what I've said this morning, because for most people, they will get on with their lives, and a week later, I'm sorry to say, will have forgotten most of what I'd said. And so, we have to recognize that we have a responsibility. Every single Christian has a responsibility to stand up and speak out. And whether that is with parliamentarians, whether it's telling others, whether it's getting people in the church to pray, all of those things are relevant. But the one option that's not possible, the one option that we can't do, is to remain silent.
If I could just chip in, Kiri, I think I agree with everything Merv said. I wasn't sure whether the question was about what do we do about the situation in this country or the situation overseas. But if I can answer the first of those, how do we and there's certainly a question here about people who say that religious persecution is rife in the UK. And actually, just want to add a footnote to all that as well. I think I'd say two things. I think first of all, take very seriously what Merv said. There is a very clear definition of persecution out there. And actually, I think if we equate the minor inconveniences that Christians in this country can sometimes face with the egregious persecution of the type that Gully has talked about, and the time that we know about, the types that we know about, if we equate what people in this country experience with that, I think we're being deeply disrespectful of people who are genuinely persecuted for their faith. And we don't have the right actually to take to ourselves the label of persecuted when other people are suffering so appallingly. Coming out of the work I did with the Foreign Office, the conviction I came out with very clearly was that the best way to address these kind of sillinesses and inconveniences and that sometimes we face in this country is to sensitize people in this country to what real violations of freedom of religion or belief globally actually look like. And the more sensitized people of faith or of no faith are in this country to those kind of global issues, the less inclined they will be to engage in behavior which is of a minor discriminatory nature in this country. So as I said, the best way to uphold freedom of religion or belief in this country is not to address the situation in this country, but to advocate for freedom of religion or belief globally. The footnote I wanted to add, I just wanted to add something to what Gully said, which is, I think there are two miracles about the church in Iran. One is that it still exists at all, but the other is, and this is slightly off topic, but important to say, I think, the other is that there has been such astonishing growth amongst in the Christian growth in the Iranian diaspora since the revolution. Probably, I don't know, this is guessing, but of a scale much greater than might have occurred had the Iranian revolution not happened.
Yeah.
Can I pick up there, Kiri? Is that all right? Thank you for saying that, Philip. And I think you're absolutely right. And this is the thing about us never knowing, the results of faithful witness, yes, and things springing up in unexpected ways, not necessarily through the programs that we have and all of those kinds of things, but just through our relationships and in unexpected ways. But I wanted to pick up, if I may, on Merv's comment about protest, and Philip, in a sense, you built on that as well, because I think it's a really important one, but it does point to a kind of paradox, I think, because on one hand we're saying that persecution is an element of it is normative for Christianity, and indeed the church was birthed at a time of persecution, and Jesus's own life is testament to that. And at the same time, we're saying that doesn't make it right, and therefore we have to protest against it and speak out for justice. And it's somewhere in the tension of that paradox that the creativity is life-giving. And I think that's true of faith in many ways, but I think it's important to name it and hang on to it. So for the church in Iran, what happened in some ways was catastrophic. It was wrong. There was a lot of protest done and speaking out for injustice. At the same time, the experience led the community to a closer walk with Christ and a deeper understanding of the cross. So there's a kind of inherent paradox in there, which seems to me quite significant.
Kiri, can I the risk of prolonging this is so interesting and fascinating, and it's really important. I'd pick up on something that Guli just said. I mean, I think I always remember meeting and having an audience with Pope Shenouda in Egypt before he died, not long before he died, and I remember his opening. In fact, I was with. In that meeting, I was with Bishop John Perry, one of your predecessors, Guli, in Chelmsford. And I remember Pope Shenouda started the conversation by saying to me that he said the church in Egypt began when St. Thomas, was it Thomas? Anyway, come on, bishops, you should know which one it was. But anyway, one of the apostles, I think it might have been Thomas, but anyway, was dragged through the streets of Alexandria by his neck, and that was how the church in Egypt was started.
Mark.
And sorry,
St. Mark.
Yeah, I knew it wasn't. I knew it, of course, St. Mark. Yeah, sorry.
Thomas went to India.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
And to Iran, actually, Thomas. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, guys. But yeah, so St. Mark, but he said that's how the church started. So it started with persecution, although whether that quite fits that description, I'm not sure. But anyway, he said, and we've been persecuted ever since. But he said we don't speak out against it. We accept it. And I always remember that's how we started. We've always been persecuted, but we accept it. And I said to him, well, you might accept it, but I'm not prepared to accept it. And there is a kind of discussion there to be had. Is, should we accept it for ourselves, but speak up for others that are going through it? But nevertheless, it is right to speak out, even though we might expect it. And I think actually the Coptic church in Egypt is a tremendous example of people going through persecution, yet speaking up for others. And Archbishop Angelus, who was on our last seminar, he is a tremendous example of this. They speak up for others that are going through persecution, but they don't always speak up for themselves. But it is, so there is a tension there. You're absolutely right to draw attention to it. But, Paul defended himself. He claimed Roman citizenship and all of those kind of things. It's not wrong to speak up, but I guess it's knowing where the line is. But interesting discussion. Sorry to prolong it, Kiri.
Thank you. It's wonderful to hear all your reflections. I also think that in your response, you've also nudged towards one of the questions that Bishop Philip raised in his opening remarks. We have had, there's two questions that are quite similar, so I will sort of bring them together. One from Nigel Parker. If not persecution, what is the most accurate term to describe the state of religious freedom in the UK and the pressure, particularly on believers with socially conservative religious beliefs, to conform with predominant ideologies? And someone else has mentioned that obviously we have legal redress in the UK that we don't have perhaps in other countries, but that is there a risk that things here could get worse? I know you've all mentioned this line that we perhaps have not yet crossed, but is there a danger that we might? That's a few thoughts in one, but if you have any reflections, Bishop Philip, I'll start with you if you want to.
Thank you. And just briefly, because I suspect this is more Merv's area of expertise than mine. First of all, Nigel, great to have you here. Thank you very much. Good to have you with us. One of my recommendations in the independent review of the Foreign Office was that the Foreign Office should do some more work on defining the sliding scale, and as it were, marking the points on it. Now, clearly that would be something that one would use internationally, but there's absolutely no reason why something similar should not be used, or indeed the same tool should not be used domestically. And I think defining terms around all of this is really important. And I don't want to be complacent about the situation in this country. I think there are serious issues around freedom of speech at the moment, and I think we do need to stand up for it. There've been it was International Press Freedom Day, I think, a couple of days ago. So these issues, the right to speak, the right to disagree, these are serious rights, and we do need to stand up for them. And I hope the learning that we learn in this area, we can actually also apply in others as well.
Bishop Gully, would you like to add, or Mervyn, indeed?
Merv, I think this is more area. Your area. Let's hear from you.
Yeah, thank you, bishops. I don't know what you would term it, because actually, the question is, what would we term it? It's so. To be honest with you, it's the cases that we hear about of discrimination. I guess I would call it first and foremost discrimination, and maybe with some marginalisation. But even that is not. It's not a concerted campaign to discriminate against Christians, and it is sporadic. It will vary from place to place, and it's not something that we can say that there are the majority of Christians, the far majority of Christians in this country go about their everyday life without recognizing that there is even discrimination against them. They might feel that they're that we are not always heard in the way that we want to be heard, and so I certainly wouldn't describe it any more than some kind of discrimination. Having said that, some people who have been discriminated against and have lost court cases, and we think of some of the more famous cases, and they are few and far between. But the lady who lost her job at British Airways for wearing a cross, that was discrimination, and she might well have felt herself that it was even persecution. She might have used that term. It would have been the wrong term, but she certainly would have felt very aggrieved. I think when it comes to, and Nigel asked the question about, talks particularly about those that might hold more conservative, if you might call them orthodox Christian views on some things such as sexuality and that kind of things. I think very often we do have to recognise, and Gully, I loved your point earlier about the fact about there is no right not to be offended, and I think too often the Christian church do take offence, whereas we should just let things wash over our heads and accept that people will have different views to us. And I also think that, and particularly on the subjects I just talked about, sexuality and all of those kind of areas, it's such a there's such a debate in the church as a whole on these things, and sometimes Christians do not help themselves by the language that they use. And this is and I'm sorry, but we don't. Some of the and it's not just on those issues as well. Sadly, I stood outside Parliament not that long ago and heard a guy shouting and screaming at journalists and MPs that the end of the world was nigh, and you know, that they were all sinners and they were all going to go to hell, and you know, that's not the way to do it. And so I think we just often ought to be careful at the way we express ourselves, but nevertheless we do have a right to express ourselves, but we must recognize that everybody else has that right too. So I mean, we could talk about this and around this for a very, very long while, but I think the important thing to recognize is that we could be on a sliding scale. There is no doubt that because nobody knows, and as we've said a couple of times now, it rarely comes from nowhere, and we should be vigilant. But we should also, as Christians, be prepared to speak out for the discrimination that other faiths, because we are not the only faith in this country that could say that we are discriminated against. And we might sometimes feel, and I think, you know, Philip, when Jeremy Hunt asked you to do this review, it's because he felt that the Foreign Office in particular was paying more attention to other faiths being persecuted than the Christian. That's why he asked you to talk about Christian persecution, and he may well have been right. There is some political correctness in some of this, but as Christians, we must always be sure to speak, whether it's discrimination, whether it's marginalization, whether it's disinformation, whatever it is, or whether it's persecution, we should be prepared to speak out and to name it, and to make sure, you know, these are early warnings very often. And if you go back to some of the, regime change in Iran was slightly different, but normally there'll be early warnings of what's coming up. And we must be ready to speak out when we see those early warnings and to act too.
Thank you, Mervyn. We've come up to the end of our time, unfortunately. I know there's so many areas we could press into, but thank you so much for your contributions. And we will be in touch with more information following these results, so keep an eye on your inbox. And just to remind you that there's one final event in this series on the 25th of May at 12 p.m, Religious Freedom, the Refugee Crisis and the Role of the Church, how lack of freedom of religion or belief is often a root cause of forced migration, and we'll be joined for that by Dr. Krish Kandaya. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.